Welcome back to the Kruze Consulting Pitch Deck course. Excited to be joined by Haya yet again as we walk through the slides that you use to raise early stage venture capital funding. Haya is joining us from, where are you today?
I am on an animal sanctuary. So if you hear some weird animals behind me, there might be a rooster or something. That would be why.
All right. Everybody add an extra slide to your appendix every time you hear a rooster.
It's a good game. It's a good game. I like it.
All right. So we're going to do the team slide today, which is generally a pretty important slide. And so I'm very excited to talk about this one. As we have mentioned before, we have an entire course outlining the important slides in a venture capital pitch deck. It's available for free, so please find it online. And you can also find it on YouTube as we share these videos. The course is available at kruzeconsulting.com/pitch-deck. That's KRUZE consulting.com/pitch-deck. So we're going to talk about the team slide here today. We're not going to go over our background because we assume you've already seen our background from going through this course. But why is this slide so important?
So I think, especially in the earliest stages of a company, right, there's only so many things that an investor uses as information to decide whether or not to invest. And, in later stages, you get away with anything. If you have traction, you're making tons of sales, nothing else essentially matters. In the earliest stages, if you think about the information that an investor has available about you, the team you have, and especially the founder team, is basically it, right? And so if you are an inventor that invented a brand new technology and you're starting a company in this field, your team kind of becomes part of your moat. It means that there is literally nobody else in the world who can do this. Or similarly, if you were like a super senior person in a car company and you spin out and you do something else, well, your little Rolodex, your connections, your experience makes you uniquely positioned to build this one particular company. And I think the way you tell the story of a company, especially on the founder team, varies a lot based on how good the kind of the founder market fit is for the particular company you're building.
Excellent. And so I think you highlighted a few important items in there. One thing I will point out as someone who used to be a venture capitalist who invested anywhere from the seed to the Series B and beyond is that, let's double down on the idea that this slide does change as your business matures.
Yep.
Right. So at the very beginning, this is really important because you're generally just a few people with an idea. And so the idea is important and the people are important. As you get bigger, you start to have metrics that the investors can use to judge you. And just doubling down on what Haya is saying here is your ability to attract talent really matters. So at the Series B and at the Series C and beyond, the investors are going to want to know, what is that next layer of managers? Who are they? Have you been able to attract the best talent? So this slide is just going to change. It's going to change as your company grows. So do not use the same slide for your Series C that you used for your seed. You're going to have to change it as you go.
Well, and it changes a lot too, right? As the founder team, you are basically the people doing most of the work until like the first couple of years of the company. The founding team and maybe a couple of key employees, that's where you start. As you get further and further down the line, your individual skill doesn't really matter as much. Even if you're a really good developer, hopefully you hire better developers than you. That's the whole point. And so it shifts. Like in the beginning, the story is very much like, can this team get us to a point where we can raise more money and grow the team? Later on, it's more a question of, is this team really good at hiring the best people in the industry? I was working recently with a client who basically said, hey, we invented this new technology in this super niche market, and I'm about to hire my entire old team with me because they're the only people who can do this. And I was like, wait a minute. So if you are successful in that, then essentially there's nobody in the world who can copy your company because the super niche skill set to do this company doesn't exist anywhere else. That becomes such a powerful, both, it massively increases the speed that you can build your company, but it also means that, even if somebody has the same idea and a giant sack of cash, they can't build the same company. And I think there's something to that story if you can tell that story.
I agree. In fact, I worked with a company very recently that is in a regulated industry. And the founder had, for a similar business, already jumped through all the regulatory hurdles. And so knew which attorneys to hire in which geographies, knew which regulators would push back on particular things or not. And so that was one of the competitive advantages to this business. And one of the reasons why this investor was very successful at raising funding was, hey, I've already done this thing that you may not even realize is a barrier to entry, but I've already knocked it down. So keep that in mind as you're building the slide. Like, why are you uniquely positioned, right? And so what is this slide for? As we've kind of talked about it here, it's like, can somebody else just walk in and do this? If someone else had the same amount of money as you have, can they just go and do this? And sometimes the team is not the barrier to entry. Sometimes there are network effects, or there are other aspects to the business that mean you get ahead of the curve, and being the first to market matters. But we have time and time again seen industries where a lot of people have the same idea, and a lot of companies raise money, and then they all kind of choke each other to death, unfortunately. Right. One of my favorite examples is a company called Munchery, which delivered food, and it was a great product. Unfortunately, this food delivery market didn't have a lot of barriers to entry, and so other smart folks raised a bunch of money, and it was sort of no one could get a sustainable business there. There's too much noise going on, right? Everybody who wanted to meal order kit thing type, like, everybody was doing it. So it was pretty brutal. So the team didn't matter kind of as much there, but you want to show why you've got something special on the team.
Yeah. Well, and your team, what I think it boils down to is that your team, as a founding team, needs some sort of a superpower. If you're the best developer out there, great, that is your superpower. If you know every player in the market, and that makes your sales go 100 times faster, amazing. You can leverage that, right? If you know the industry, if you have patents, whatever it is that this team brings to the table, like, this is where I always get a little bit skeptical when you get a couple of people who kind of leave Facebook and start a company in a space that has nothing to do with what they were doing before, and where they haven't got any previous experience. Right. I recently spoke to a couple of founders who used to be in the AR lab at Apple. They span out and started something in AR. And I'm like, yeah, no, that makes sense. You were at the cutting edge.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
now you as a team you're free of the shackles of Apple. You get to do something else. If that same team went and started a food delivery service, I'd be like, okay, what are we doing here, guys? I agree that you're probably very smart, but you don't have the extra leverage that any other player in this market would have. And I think this also affects where in the deck you put your team slide, right? If your team is uniquely positioned and the only people who can do it, front load it. This is an important part of your story. And so there's some companies that have really amazing teams, but that don't immediately strike you as like a slam dunk. And then in retrospect, they still did really well. Do you have an example of that?
Well, so a company that is doing very well right now, where the team didn't necessarily have direct experience in the industry in terms of they hadn't worked at companies that were really doing this, is a company called Brex, which is a credit card solution for small businesses. And at this moment, they're doing quite well, and they have raised a ton of money. I think it's over $500 million or something like that. And a lot of Kruze Consulting's clients currently use them. And the founders were two young people who had done a few startups, their own small startups before, with some success. However, they weren't slam dunk fintech founders, but the way that they positioned it was they had experience in starting companies, and they'd also experienced this pain point firsthand. So that is a way that you can say, hey, listen, I've never done this type of company before, but I can tell you I've experienced this problem as a founder, so I know what the product needs to look like on the other end, right? So
I think the beautiful thing there is that essentially you're saying, hey, we are scratching our own itch. We are experts on the problem. Now let's go and build a solution. And if then you can back that up with a story of, hey, we're very good founders at building solutions, suddenly the story comes together beautifully, even though you don't have like that core little element.
Exactly. And there's a place where this does become it becomes a little bit harder. It's easier to talk about this more on the enterprise business model side. On the consumer side, it can become a little more challenging. So you do need to be careful if you have worked at enterprises and you're starting a consumer company, saying, hey, it's hard for me to cook dinner, therefore I started a food delivery service. Like, that isn't going to resonate as well as, hey, I worked for this large company and we always had a problem with our accounts payable, therefore I'm creating an accounts payable solution. Like that, I think clicks a little bit better for investors. That's not to say all sorts of smart people can't try to start consumer businesses. It's just, everybody's got an opinion, so it's
totally.
a little bit harder.
Great. Well, and it's the place where you see that very well, actually, and a lot, is in healthcare. So I know one company that created a training tool for surgeons, right, in VR. And, they were surgeons and they were like, these training seminars are horrible and not good enough. And they were like, we don't know anything about VR, but we think we can build a better solution here, because they had such deep connections with the equipment manufacturers for the various types of equipment. And they were like, oh, this is a real problem that's costing these equipment manufacturers so much money that we can sell this product at such a high value, because otherwise it has to be manual in-person trainings. And of course, this was before COVID. When COVID hit, they definitely just flew off the handle.
Exactly.
And I think having such deep levels of insights into a market that nobody else has, or where, there's not a lot of surgeons starting companies, because surgery is a really well-paid job and people are not willing to leave a well-paying surgery job. So you get this really weird dynamics where it makes a lot of sense to start a startup if you're brave enough to leave your high-paying surgery job.
Exactly. Yeah. That's kind of one of the paradoxes here of starting a startup. The other thing to think through is that, let's say you're starting a telemedicine company and you are not a physician or a pharmacist or whatever, having someone who is that with those credentials who's joined your team as a co-founder or as an early employee can help bolster your credibility. A slightly less good way to try to build up the slide is to bring on folks who are advisors. However, I think VCs tend to look through that a little bit more these days, because a lot of folks will have slides that show a bunch of advisors. And then when they talk to those advisors, they're really not doing anything for the company other than maybe getting some shares. So,
right.
That there's starting to be some skepticism around kind of quote, what an advisor really is driving. So if you're going to show advisors, it probably makes sense to have them actually having an advisory agreement and providing some sort of services to you on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. All right. So should we get into the meat of this here? Should we show some slides? So we have two pitch deck examples that are Google Slides that are free for you to download. Again, they're at thekruzeconsulting.com/pitch deck. I'll show them right now and we can talk through these two team slides.
Love it.
All right. Again, just to remind everybody, the example companies we've come up with are intended to be slightly facetious. We're not trying to actually sell you these companies. We're trying to show you how to build a pitch deck. So let's not get into the details too much on what these businesses are, or kind of dig too much into that. But this first one that I'm showing is a startup focused on the beer delivery space. How you want to talk about what you've got on this team slide and why it matters?
Yeah. So in this particular slide, I actually put the things on the slide in a slightly weird order. Normally you would expect to see the CEO first, right? But what I was thinking here is like, look, there is something very specific about this where you need to have like a super deep industry expert. And in this case, our CEO is Espen, and he has built 3 startups and has sold one to Google, right? And so you can tell the story there about how he knows how to raise money, how he knows to run that kind of company operations and that sort of stuff. And that is super important. But in this particular startup, what is more important is what the COO is doing. In this particular example, I made up a person who's been at a brewery for 15 years as a head brewer. Now, that is a very specific skill set with lots of deep knowledge about beer, about how to brew beer and all that kind of stuff. And, brewery operations are very operations heavy. And so you're kind of talking about, he doesn't have startup operations experience, but there's transferable skills in here. So you can kind of fudge it a little bit. And then you have this husband and wife team who are the CTO and the VP of marketing. You would typically not put them on the same picture, but I like that stock image, so that's what I used. But they're part of the original Netflix AI team. Now, Netflix recommendation engine is incredibly well known. And so in these 3 people, you can start telling a really good story of how you have like the startup building skills, the deep beer making and beer tech skills, I guess, and then the recommendation engine. And so that's how you tell the story. You put together the elements of how this works. You call out whatever relevant companies there are. Now, and if one of these had worked in a enterprise SaaS company and done something completely irrelevant, don't put it on the slide. It is part of their story, but it doesn't serve the story you're telling for this particular company.
Yeah. And so put yourself in the shoes of the venture capitalist. They are trying to decide, do I want to give you money? Do I trust you to bring this idea to fruition? And also, I'm going to be on your board. I'm probably going to be talking to you once or twice a month for the next 5 to 10 years. Do I want to do that? Like, are you someone who I want to be around that much? And one of the things that I think that this slide is showing is that to the extent you are a consumer VC who's interested in the beverage industry, these seem like people who would actually be pretty interesting to be around. So that's a really strong positive.
I mean, look at that beard.
The beard is pretty impressive. Yes, they do look like they would be very fun to have at your cocktail party. I would definitely recommend you invite them over for New Year's Eve. But that's not necessarily what you're trying to prove. But again, the VC wants to know, do I want to spend time with these people? Yep. Right. And can they bring this idea to life?
And I guess the other piece worth noting there is, are they coachable? There are so many people as a VC that you work with that are like, you have to be a little special kind of crazy to run a startup. That is objectively true. But you also have to be a tiny little slice humble. And there's this strange balance, right? Because founders are the kind of people who see a future that doesn't exist and believe in it, but they also need to be able to take a little bit of feedback. And I think that balance is kind of important to try and get across as part of your whole presentation. The team slide may not be the right place to do that, but it's worth keeping in the back of your mind.
So one thing that's very interesting about being a startup founder is when a company is very small, you're a doer. You have to get stuff done. Yep. And there reaches a point where the team is growing, where you have a lot of people that are doing a lot of things for you. You're still doing, but you have to focus a little more towards strategy and also hiring and culture. Yep. And some of the founders that I work with, some of the best ones at the Series A, Series B, basically say that their job is chief recruiter. That's mostly what they're doing, because yep. the product is baked. The strategy, at least in the super near term, everyone understands what they're trying to do. And so they're just trying to add people to the business. And then eventually at the later stage, strategy is very important. There's a lot of politics, making yep. sure everybody's on the same page and is working well together, and the team dynamics are strong, culture is strong. And so your role evolves over time. So are you Absolutely. The person that can sit and, let's say you're a developer, do the coding, and then later do the hiring? Are you personable enough? Do you have that sort of almost like a sales mentality, or are you going to be selling? Or are you going to be able to get in front of potential customers and push your product? And then, are you going to grow up to be the person that has a big team and you can manage a big team? And it's pretty amazing how much the role changes. Yeah, the founder and CEO's role changes as the company
and
grows.
The most extreme version of this is Zuckerberg, right? He started off as a one-person dude making a Facebook for universities, and now he's in front of Congress defending his company. Those jobs couldn't be more different. And he must have been coachable and taken a lot of advice and a lot of coaching all the way through. If he wasn't coachable, his board would have booted him off a long time ago. That's right. And I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind, because if you are the perfect founder for the stage you are at now and unwilling to change, you're not going to be the perfect founder when you get closer to IPO.
No. Very good point. All right, let's switch over to the enterprise pitch deck example that we have. Yep. This is a software product, SaaS product for starting out for plumbers. And so you want to talk about a little bit what we've got on this slide here?
Yeah. So with this one, I kind of making the same point as I'm making in the other slide deck, which is the CTO here has had incredible, deep experience in the industry, right? 8 years as an emergency plumber, like the kind of person who shows up at 3 a.m. when there's poop all over your floor, without mincing words. But the part of the story here is that he had an accident, right? It's not specified what that accident was, but he had to retrain. So he has the deep experience in plumbing, had to retrain because he couldn't do physical labor anymore, and retrain as a software developer. Since then, he's been a 2-time founder. Now, this slide should ideally say something about whether those were exits or what happened to those companies. If it just says 2x founder, my alarm bell goes off immediately. I was like, well, you did it twice, but are you any good? So, as a founder, you have to be prepared to defend that part of the slide. And then there's his co-founder, Elise, who, has an MBA and clearly has deep business acumen again. 4 years of operations in a large plumbing firm, again, has deep expertise for what the needs are of these customers, and then built her own house and did all the plumbing herself. Is that relevant? Probably not, but it makes for an interesting story. Now, the thing that isn't on either of these slides is how big the rest of the team is. These slides are both extremely focused on the founding team, and most of the time that is fine because they're the ones who are having the conversations with the VCs. But what you have to keep in mind is that this is going to evolve as and when the the team grows and the founders, as we just talked about, take less and less of the hands-on experience and more of the leadership positions. So what I would typically do is either add if you have a large enough team, I would add a second slide, which is what with like the VP level positions and how many people are under each thing, or just put like a plus 19 on the bottom, just to get an idea of the team size in general, because there's a very big difference in funding a 200-person company versus a 9-person company. And I think headcount is a really good proxy for the type of conversations you're about to have with your founder, with your investor.
Yeah, and again, the venture capitalists realize that running a 10-person company as the CEO is very different than running a 200-person company. So if your company is getting larger in terms of headcount, having the org chart in the appendix is a way of proving to them that, hey, I understand how to build a scalable organization. Yeah, this is my current vision for that. Now, to the extent the VC wants to challenge you on that, that's not a bad sign. That actually might be okay. They might say, hey, why is product and R&D in the same org? Why are they not separate?
Yeah,
right. And that
or why are you hiring 35 marketing people when in your type of company, a marketing agency would make a lot more sense. Those are big strategic conversations that are great to have with your board. And so doing that is fantastic. What I really like to do in the appendix is to have 2 org charts. One is a snapshot of where you are now, and one is a snapshot of where you're hoping to be at the end of the runway for the current fundraise. So you basically have a hiring plan as 2 org charts, and that it's such a good tool for having really powerful conversations. And it shows as a founder how good you are at planning into the future. Now, is your final org chart going to be correct? Absolutely not, because things change. But it's the thought process and your ability to plan ahead that is really being judged here.
Right. And what you're showing with that is a few things. Hopefully, one, you're showing that you're coachable. So if they challenge you on anything, the response ought to be, I'm excited to have this conversation with you. Here was the thought process that got me here, but I want to hear your thought process. Help me understand what other things I should be thinking about and put into mine, right? So 1, be coachable. And then 2, you're showing what the business needs to grow, right? If you're an enterprise company and you need salespeople, you better show a lot of salespeople coming on board, right? If you have a lot of hardcore product to build, you better show a lot of product people coming on. If you need a lot of customer service, you ought to show a lot of them coming on here. You're showing the investors how the organization needs to scale to support their growth.
Yeah. And the important thing about team there is that, especially in the early stages, you hire for whatever is core to your company. So if you are a heavy software development driven company, don't use external software development agencies. But you could, for example, if you are heavy software development, but the growth marketing doesn't really matter that much, you could get away with having a very lean marketing team and then outsource the rest to an agency that does that for you. Or similarly, if you are mostly a consumer brand where, the software doesn't really matter that much, you're kind of just, you really are a brand and a marketing org, then you better have a lot of marketing people in-house, because that's where the weight of the company is. And so by showing the org chart, you're actually showing your hand as to where you think you need in-house people and core people and what you can outsource to agencies or freelancers or what have you.
Great. Perfect. Well, so let's talk about some of the typical issues that we see on this slide. And we've highlighted some of these, but would like to try to kind of consolidate all of it. I'm just going to throw the first one out here, which is just names with a bunch of logos underneath them.
Yeah,
a lot of VCs don't like that very much, and particularly if it's not if you're doing an enterprise company that's selling into the sales organization and the logos are Salesforce and HubSpot and Marketo or something like that, okay, that kind of makes sense. But if it's Apple and some small company no one's ever heard of, that doesn't really tell anything. It's just a pretty slide.
Yeah. On one of my very first startup founder slide, I put the Nokia logo and people got super excited. And it's not a lie. I built the entire press website and press outlet for Nokia. But then when I dug a little bit deeper, like, oh, what did you do for Nokia? Did you build electronics? I was like, no, I built their press site. And they were like, what the hell is this Nokia logo doing on the slide? So think about what the story is, right? The Nokia, I thought Nokia looked impressive. I mean, I have to admit, this is many years ago. Nokia did look impressive. And at the time, Nokia was an important company. But the thing I did for them had just no relevance whatsoever for the company. And I kind of shot myself in the foot. Everybody got excited about Nokia. And I talked about it and they were like, well, great. So think about that too. If you were I don't know, if you were a cleaner at Google, that's great. You made some money, but that doesn't mean you get to put a Google logo on your slide deck because it just isn't relevant. And even the ones that are relevant, I feel like logos, they start the conversation, but they don't really highlight whether or not you're a high-skilled person or whether you are the best in your field.
Right. So what I like about what you've done and the example here, for example, is there's a story on here, right? A story about how this person was a plumber, which is extremely relevant, and then became a software developer. That's pretty tight. And then the CEO is showing a lot of operational chops and founding chops. And then again, on the beer slide, which I've just flipped over to, we're showing the brewery experience. It's very solid. Great. I think I'll stop sharing now.
Sounds good.
Maybe I should have done this here. But anyway, stop sharing. The other thing is not changing as the company grows, right? So your seed deck team slide should not be the same as for the Series A. It's very well. It's pretty improbable that there haven't been some additions to your team, and it's probably different how you want to talk about it.
And I actually talk to all of my clients about this, and they typically, when they come to me for a Series A, they've taken their seed deck, duplicated it, and changed all the data. And I'm like, no, you have a completely different story now. If you don't have a different story, you failed as a company. You didn't learn enough, right? And I feel like it's actually much easier to just take a breath, throw away your old deck, and start over.
Right.
If you love the template, maybe use that. But everything about your company, if you haven't learned an incredible amount, both about the market, about what you're building and all that kind of stuff, everything is new, everything is different. And in startup world, 18 months is an eternity.
Right.
So,
but again, like as your company is growing and hopefully succeeding, there are different elements that are changing, right? And one of the elements that should be changing and getting more professional and better and bigger is your team. So this slide ought to evolve. Even if you 100%. Don't throw away your pitch deck, this slide ought to evolve.
100%.
So one of the other issues that I have noticed is that there are, 1 in 10 VCs have very strong opinions that are often a little quirky about the team slide. And so I highly recommend you search their website, or you do a Google search for that investor's name or that fund's name and team and slide and pitch deck, just to see if they have said something really peculiar, so that you can adjust this slide before you go in to meet with them. So
really good point.
Just a caveat there. And again, you never know which VC it's going to be, but there are a few who've just had really strong opinions about the slide. So just be prepared. One of the places that I've seen issues is with academics who are, say, PhD or PhD candidates in a very specific field, wanting to found a company. And many academics have been extremely successful. I could think of the founders of Google who are academics. They might have done a pretty good job there, right? But just being humble and understanding that being an expert in a particular very complicated field is not the same as being the business person running an entity, I think is pretty important. I don't know.
Yeah.
Have you seen that before?
Yeah, lots of times. And I think what happens a lot is, especially in like highly technical fields, like a lot of people spinning companies out of MIT or similar to that. MIT is actually kind of a bad example because they have a pretty good entrepreneurship program with that. But they've identified it, right? It's like, hey, there are opportunities here, but academia alone doesn't get you there. Yeah. And I think that is worth thinking about it as the team slide tells a story of how you have the complete package for everything that's needed to build a company. And if something important is missing from that package, you need to go find that or tell a story around it. It doesn't help if you have like 2 of the world's best engineers and like a PhD who invented something. If you have 0 marketing and 0 running company experience, that's not investable. Because as an investor, I would look at that and go, wait a minute, great, you've got a prototype, but I don't believe that you're going to take this one prototype into 10,000 products that are out there.
Right.
And so it becomes that believability piece. It's like, am I going to put my money behind this? And is there an opportunity for a 20 or 100x return or whatever the fund metric is?
Great. I agree. And so again, I say being proud and very clear about what you've accomplished and your qualifications, but being humble about the stuff you don't know, or that the VC is asking or making noises like you may not know. And that applies to not just academics, that applies to any founder.
Yeah. Well, and we
So
also see that from the other side, like people who spin out of very large companies. I used the example of a car company earlier. I saw a founding team once that had a extremely senior engineer from a car company. And I said to him, hey, when was the last time you touched a CAD package? He goes, oh, I was like, right, well, you have lots of experience in building cars, but you haven't done any of the actual work for 20 years, right? And so like, who is going to do the CAD build? Like, who is going to do that part of the work? And he had a very good answer, which was, oh, actually, I have an agency that does part of that for me. And we're about to hire a junior who has much more fresh experience. Great. But you have to think about that. And, when the company grows and starts manufacturing, that person's skill set becomes more and more relevant, and suddenly they are indispensable. But in the early days, it's kind of like you have to match the current recent experience with where the company is now. And I think that is just part of it doesn't have to be part of the team slide, but you have to understand that that is what the investor is looking for. It doesn't matter that you have all the senior people in the world. CEOs at a Fortune 500 company are terrible at doing startups because they haven't done any of that work recently.
That's an excellent point. In fact, I can recall coming out of a large-ish company. It wasn't even that big. It was several thousand people in public. The questions for me were, hey, can you still do things? Right. You have a big team, you have a big budget.
Yeah.
The organization has an accounting team that helps out. The organization has this all sorts of HR team, recruiting team. You're going to have to do all this stuff. Are you still a doer? And there are some companies, big companies, software companies in Silicon Valley that are famous for having executives who spin out and try to join or start startups and kind of fall on their face because they don't have all the scaffolding that helps them be really good. So just do be careful. Just because you've been at a huge company and had a big division with big budget, there's all sorts of minutia that you have to deal with and get stuff done. You have to roll up your sleeves. So make sure it's clear that you are able to do that and you're excited to do it. Yeah, because there's a lot of tedium that you start to avoid as you become a senior executive at a large company.
Yeah. Well, and the big warning flag that often comes up for investors is people who have they call themselves 10x engineers, but without a DevOps team, i.e. the people who can take the code and make it run on servers and be ready for production, they're I'm not going to say nothing, but they're just very inexperienced. And that part of technology has moved on very, very quickly. And if you don't have that skill set within your company, you're not going to be successful. It doesn't matter that you have all this other experience. So look, the investors are not trying to trip you up. They're not trying to screw you over. What they're trying to do is to make sure that they're making sensible and investment that show fiduciary responsibility to their investors. And realistically, they just have to be able to say that, hey, I have every faith that this team is going to be able to do what they say they're going to do. If you're able to say that with your team slide, great. That's a very short conversation. But sadly, often it isn't because people overlook that.
It's going to be very rare that a founding team has the exact perfect experience, right? I have started a company in the same industry and I grew it and sold it for $1 billion. And now I'm doing it again. That doesn't happen very often.
Well, and even then, that is a 7-year journey. So what was true 7 years ago isn't necessarily true today. So even that story isn't necessarily the perfect founder. And that is so hard to help founders understand. I have worked with that exact type of founder before, where they're like, oh yeah, I build a logistics startup. I'm building another logistics startup. I was like, whoa, pump the brakes. 10 years ago, logistics was very different than it is today. And it's all storytelling. You have to just kind of be able to defend why you are still the right person to do this company.
Right. Yeah. You're telling a story about why your team is the right team.
Yeah.
Perfect. Great. Well, I hope that this was helpful. I think we had to summarize this up. You want to summarize it up for us?
I will absolutely do that. I just have to pull up the notes.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I'll ask that question. All right.
Yep.
So, Haya, you want to summarize the team slide here?
Sure thing. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that ideas are dirt cheap. Like the two of us can come up with 1,000 ideas right now, but execution is everything. And the team slide really is a story about why your team is the right team to make this company happen.
Exactly.
I think it's about what makes you unique. Why are you the team should be part of the moat of the company, because otherwise, you're out there talking to investors, you're talking to everybody. If somebody thinks it's a great idea and they can out execute you by just raising a bit of money, that's sad, because it just means that you don't have what it takes to build this particular company. And I think we talked a little bit about the where to put the team slide. It's actually a conversation I have with a lot of my clients. And in essence, the better your team, the further towards the front of the deck it goes. And if it's so, whatever, you still need a team that can execute. But if the investor is excited enough about the rest of the company that they're kind of willing to go, okay, fine, we'll help you bolster your team, you can still successfully raise money. Just make it part of a lesser part of your story.
Right. And you can compensate for, not being a perfect overlap with what you're trying to do, or your last startup having failed, for the passion that you bring, the knowledge that you bring, the number of customers you've talked to, traction, things like that. So
one of the most powerful examples of that is a client I worked with recently. I said, you don't have any startup experience. Why are you the right person to do that? And he looked at me and was angry. He was like, my daughter died because this didn't exist. This will be my only startup. I will fight the rest of my life to fix this. Chills ran down my back and I believed him. And I was like, you know what? That's your story. Get angry, get defensive and say, look, this is what I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing. Because if your investor believes you, you're a really solid bet, because you're not going to give up. And of course, that if that isn't true for you, then don't say that. But I'm just illustrating that founders come in all sorts of stripes and they do things for all sorts of reasons. If your motivator for building this company is like core to your life, make that part of the story.
That's great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So this wraps up our team slide. And please find the rest of the course at kruzeconsulting.com/pitch-decks.
Thank you all for listening.